All right, this is going to be the early Middle Ages. There's going to be three sections to the Middle Ages, and it's just a lot of material, so we're going to have to condense just like we did with the Roman Empire. But this is actually a much more interesting period of history than you would expect. So, the story of the Middle Ages obviously starts after the end of the Roman Empire as a major political entity. And there's one major influence on the development of Western societies, and that actually starts in the East, or what we would consider the East today. And there's a new religion, and this is around 610 AD. There's a series of religious revelations that come to this guy named Muhammad. And Muhammad goes on to found a new religion called Islam. And religiously speaking, Islam is the new kid on the block. It's about 600 years younger than Christianity, and it's thousands of years younger than Judaism. And Islam gets its start at a place, or in a couple of places. There's Medina and Mecca, and these are the kind of focal points for the beginning of this religion. And these two cities, two places, are located on the western edge of the Arabian Peninsula. And the sacred texts for Islam state that God reveals a series of spiritual truths to Muhammad. And this is information on the ways of life and how to conduct yourself. Prior to this, the Arabs are all pagans, and Muhammad converts them to this new religion as part of a series of military conquests. And by 632 AD, the entire Arabian Peninsula is converted. The structure of Islam is actually fairly easy to understand. There are several fundamental ideas in Islam, and these are called the five pillars. One is a confession of faith that there is only one God, and that God is named Allah. Two, prayer, and prayer facing Mecca 5 times a day. Three, there's a social requirement, and this social requirement requires you to be charitable, giving alms to the poor at least once a year. There's also ritual number four, ritual fasting during the daylight hours of Ramadan, and the Hajj. And the Hajj is a pilgrimage to Mecca, and you are required to, or the faithful rather, are required to make this trip at least once in their lifetime, as long as they are physically able to do so. So Islam is a little more militarized than Christianity, and I don't mean that in a negative way. It's just a way of saying that as a religion, it's much more regimented than Christianity was in its early years. The Christianity was spread greatly helped by the content of the message, right? So people were drawn to this not because they were forced to it. In fact, they were officially discouraged by the Roman administration. And Islam, on the other hand, is spread by military conquest. So the central and philosophical spiritual text, if you will, is called the Quran. And it's written down sometime after the death of Muhammad. It's put to paper sometime in the mid 630s. And it's a list of instructions concerning moral behavior. There's legal directives, and of course, there's spiritual wisdom in there, divided into 144 parts. Islam was originally an oral tradition, and this comes from the idea that it's spoken word coming from these revelations given to Muhammad directly from God. And it's similar to the Bible in the sense that it has tremendous religious importance, but it's very different in terms of context. And so the Bible is often very allegorical, using metaphors or kind of stories to illustrate points. And the Quran is much, much more straightforward. In places, it almost reads a little bit like an instruction manual for life. And so it's got a little bit of a different kind of context. From the death of Muhammad in 632, there are four rulers that assume the responsibility of leadership. First is a man named Abu Bakr. He rules for 2 years and then dies of mysterious illness. Next are three more men, and they are rapidly murdered in quick succession by either followers or slaves or rivals and or what have you. And after these men, leadership passes to one family, the Umayyad family, which creates a dynasty that basically is in charge for the next 89 years. Now, the significance of the Umayyad dynasty is what's called the Arab conquests. And this is a time period between 622 and 750 AD where Islam spreads out of the Arabian Peninsula, carried by military conquest, um, beginning with Muhammad and then ending after the death of Ali in 661. Don't worry about a lot of these dates. I'll always tell you the really significant dates. Um, and I just realized as I'm sitting here that there's an awful lot of dates in this presentation, but I'll tell you the ones that I really want you to focus on. And so these conquests stretch from an area that would have been what we would think of as modern day Pakistan and Afghanistan, all the way into basically southern France, what would become southern France. And the Umayyads establish a caliphate centered at Baghdad. Of course, Baghdad is in current day Iraq. And this caliphate focuses on concentrating power, develops a gigantic bureaucracy for the purpose of taxation and revenue control, and they're also able to put an enormous and powerful army into the field. Now, under the Umayyad dynasty, there is a burst of construction, and it's mostly in the form of mosques and kind of administrative buildings. And in this time period, one of the most important buildings in Islam is constructed. It's called the Dome of the Rock. It's in Jerusalem. Here's a photograph of it. And the Dome of the Rock is built on the site of the Second Temple. The Second Temple is no longer there because Rome destroyed it in 70 AD and it wasn't rebuilt. And religious schools become associated with the ruling class and these brand new mosques that are being built. And the construction of this one building is the source of a great deal of violence and tension in the Middle East right up to this very day. And because you get different schools and different ideas uh, pertaining to Islam surrounding these mosques, you end up with multiple forms of Islam kind of taking root. And you see that today in the really wide range of types of Islam, like I guess I would say, that are being practiced out there in the world today. So you've got these extremely violent kind of anti-American type to, I mean, relatively modern kind of liberal democratic versions of it all at the same time on the same planet. Really gets started in this time period. Now, um, Islam and all of the Gothic invasions constitute the major external threats to the Eastern Roman Empire. And the Eastern Roman Empire truly morphs during this time period. In fact, under Emperor Leo III, the name changes from the Roman Empire, and they begin to call it the Byzantine Empire. The Italian peninsula falls to the Lombards. The Ostrogoths are destroyed during the Gothic Wars. We talked about that. And Byzantium, as it's called, basically ignores these facts of all of the chaos and destruction happening in what would be Europe today because they're focused on holding Islam at bay in the Balkans. So if they don't respond militarily with strength to their east, they run a great deal of being overrun and destroyed, just like all of the other places that were occupied during the Arab conquest. And the part of the way that they maintain military strength is they institute a series of military reforms, kind of forgiving taxes or letting someone skip paying taxes when they serve in the military. It actually works very, very well. Now, in the West, there is also major consolidation of power, and it's centered in the Frankish kingdoms under what's called the Carolingian dynasty. And the Carolingians managed to unify the tribes of the Franks in ways that Clovis simply could not. He couldn't muster enough. He started the process but couldn't finish it, didn't have enough administrative power. And the first in this line of Carolingians is this man, Charles Martel. And Martel is extremely important in the story of Western civilization because he stops the Islamic invasion of Europe through Spain and into southern France at the Battle of Poitiers in 733. And had he failed, the Arab conquest would have gone the uh, right across the Strait of Gibraltar, right through Spain, right into France, and could potentially have consumed the entirety of Europe. But because they were stopped at this battle, people are very thankful, and they become greatly attracted to the Carolingian dynasty. They're looking at these guys as kind of powerful figures that can do a lot for them, willing to fight for them, etc. So they're kind of drawn to this. It helps greatly with their consolidation of power. Pippin III is the son of Charles Martel, and he orchestrates a coup against and in fact, he actually had the blessing of the Pope to do this, but he orchestrated a coup against the last of the Merovingians in 751. And the Merovingians are kind of the last of the uh, Frankish tribes or kingdoms, if you will, that are not under the direct control of the Carolingians. And the Pope in Rome backs up the entire Carolingian line, going so far as to crown Pippin and his sons after the coup is successful. And you can ask yourself, why is the Pope so interested in Pippin III and the Carolingians? Well, it's good to have powerful friends, is kind of the short answer to that. Pippin attacks the Lombards in 755 and defeats them in 756. And part of the deal in the peace settlement between the Franks and the Lombards is they are required to give some of the land that has just been conquered to the Pope. And this becomes the foundation of what is called the Papal States. And the Papal States the Papal States rather stretch all the way across central Italy. And they form the site of the Pope's authority, literally in the form of a kingdom this time. So the land provides the Pope with tax revenue and all of the other benefits of major land holdings at this time. And by default, almost, the Catholic Church becomes not only a powerful religious force, but also a powerful political force as well. And that's going to have ramifications for Western civilization moving on as well. Now, by far the most important member of the Carolingian dynasty is Emperor Charlemagne. And he's a Christian. He's on relatively good terms with the Pope. However, he has a very specific idea about how to exercise power and what power means. And he believes, as a Christian would, that God is in charge of heaven. But Charlemagne, as king, as emperor, needs to be in charge on earth. And because he believes this, he demands allegiance with that idea in mind of all the people and subjects around him. Now, this idea plants the seed for conflict, because what you're saying here, if you have the authority on earth, then you're kind of already in conflict with religious authority. And so conflict begins to kind of grow between those that see the authority resting in kings versus the authority of religious officials. And this conflict between kings and their authority and religious authority is going to last for more than 1,000 years. Charlemagne remains actually quite tight with the Pope. In 799, he actually travels to Rome to rescue the Pope when the Pope's life is threatened by an invasion and attack. And while he's in Rome, Pope Leo III crowned Charlemagne as Holy Roman Emperor. And that's a little bit of wordplay because obviously at this point the Roman Empire no longer exists. People may believe they're Roman, they may claim Roman heritage, but Rome is an afterthought. But as he's crowned Holy Roman Emperor, it puts him in charge of an empire that stretches from Spain, uh, kind of the mountain border with Spain, right through to the border of the Islamic Caliphate in the east. And as Holy Roman Emperor, Charlemagne works tirelessly to continue to consolidate power. The problem with Charlemagne is that he basically outlives all of his heirs, and he's not really sure exactly what to do with his empire. All of his sons are dead, so what do I do? And eventually the job falls to his grandchildren. Uh, they inherit the Holy Roman Empire. It's three brothers, and they immediately begin to fight amongst themselves. But they eventually agree to kind of a provisional treaty, the Treaty of Verdun. That would be 843. And they split up the empire into three pieces. So Charles the Bald gets the western chunk of the Holy Roman Empire. That would be modern day France. Louis the German gets the eastern chunk. That would be modern day Germany. And Lothar gets the center, and that is the old area controlled by the Lombards and um, areas surrounding the newly formed Papal States. And this division of the Holy Roman Empire has two very, very, very important um, effects, and it's critical for you to know this. And I guarantee you these two will show up on an exam or a quiz at some point, probably both. Because of the division of the Holy Roman Empire, we begin to see the formation of kingdoms that roughly correspond with the location of modern states. So if you look at this map, you can see almost your how Germany is in roughly the shape of where Germany would be today, and France is beginning to be in roughly the shape that it is today. Number two, it firmly establishes the idea of so-called Latin Christendom. And this is extremely critical because it emphasizes a shared culture, a shared religion. And that helps begin to develop this idea of yes, we may live in different kingdoms, but we are all Europeans. We are all kind of cut from one general religion. We all have the same allegiance to the Catholic Pope, etc., etc. So you're beginning to see kind of modern states develop in modern, or not, excuse me, you're not beginning to see modern states develop. You're beginning to see kingdoms develop where modern states will eventually be. And you're also seeing the beginning of a shared culture in Europe. Now, note that we haven't mentioned Spain. And there's a very good reason for that. Spain in this time period simply does not exist as a feature of Western uh, culture. It is occupied. So between 711 and 716, the lower portion of the Spanish Peninsula is overrun and occupied by Muslim armies. And this tightens the grip that the Visigoths have on their last little remaining bit of space. They are now trapped completely between the Carolingian Empire, and that would be Charlemagne and all the Franks, which are to the north, and the Islamic Caliphate, which is to the south. And it's going to be quite a while before um, the Caliphate is driven out of Spain. But what it also does is it brings a lot of the ideas, cultural traditions, architecture especially, into what is essentially mainland Europe, um, and creates yet another kind of melting pot of ideas and culture. Britain is also in this time period resolving itself and consolidating power. And basically, you end up with the creation of 7 kingdoms, and the ones that are very important and you need to know are Mercia, Wessex, Northumbria, and East Anglia. These are the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, which we've been talking about, and it's directly across the channel from Charlemagne's empire. Um, no one kingdom in the British Isles is able to overcome the other in battle. There's lots of fighting between these groups, but no one is able to just conclusively um, defeat the other. The only person that even comes close is King Offa of Mercia, and he might have succeeded eventually in defeating the others. I mean, he's got a large land area, so he's got tremendous amount of resources he can draw on. He can organize a pretty good size army in the field, and but he doesn't get the chance. All of his chances of success are shattered when the Vikings began conducting raids, and this is in 793, and that is definitely a date you are going to need to know. And the beginning of Viking raids into Britain leads to more than 100 years of attacks on Britain and kind of stunts all of the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms from consolidating power in the same way that Charlemagne and the Franks had done, and all of the different Islamic rulers had done um, during the Arab conquests.